This is part 2 of the story that I wrote, The Way Out. Days passed by on into weeks and then months, followed by years, as many travelers passed by this large opening, never knowing that deep inside its darkness was a lonely, terrified soul. Then one day another traveler came upon the hole, and instead of walking past like so many others before her, she stopped to look deeper inside. This compassionate soul was moved in her spirit when her eyes fell upon the girl, who was now a grown woman. Being wise as well as compassionate, this angel of mercy went away to gather a group of people to help with the rescue. The angel of mercy used wisdom in not gathering a large crowd, but rather she chose a select few to join her at the top of the pit. This angel of mercy stood at the opening and ever so gently called down to this woman, so childlike in her fear, which was still curled up at the bottom of the ditch. And after many days of calling out to her, allowing the wounded one to become accustomed to her voice, the angel of mercy began the descent herself down into the pit. It was a long, hard climb down into the darkness. However, unlike the wounded one at the bottom, this angel of mercy was very aware of the ray of light, the presence of God, that pierced the darkness of this tomb. Fearlessly she descended ever lower into the unknown. Some of the helpers that she'd brought along followed her down as far as they could go. They stopped at the various points along the way, for the lower the descent, the more graphic the pictures became that were etched into the stonework, capturing the horrors of the prison below. The deeper the angel of mercy went into the very bowels of this darkness, the greater her heart ached for the childlike wounded woman and the existence she was forced to endure. The angel of mercy continued to speak truth and love to the wounded one as she made her way ever deeper into the pit. And finally, the day came when the angel of mercy arrived at the side of the wounded one, who still had not moved from her curled up position in the center of her cell. Sitting on the ground beside her, the angel of mercy continued to speak words of safety, comfort, peace, love, and acceptance. Although the wounded one still had her ears plugged with mud, some of the words were able to get through. And as time passed, she learned the meaning behind these words, and they began to penetrate deep into her heart. After some time, the angel of mercy gently reached out and touched the wounded one. Her touch, so gentle, safe, and comforting, could not even be felt by the wounded one, who had so long ago become numb and lifeless. This did not frustrate nor discourage the angel of mercy, who just continued to speak both words of comfort and truth to the wounded one. And eventually her persistence paid off, for one day, the wounded one responded to the gentle touch. With her eyes still shut tight, the wounded one lifted her head and faced the direction of the voice that seemed like the very breath of life to her. And as the wounded one began to feel again, the touch, although gentle, brought a measure of pain with it. Over time, she slowly came to trust the angel of mercy, and she welcomed her comforting presence. She eventually allowed the angel of mercy to embrace her with a hug, and ever so slowly, feeling began to return to every part of her being. Up until this point, the wounded one had been unaware of the ray of light that pierced the darkness of her prison, but now that she began to feel again, she became fearfully aware of its presence. Well, unlike her response as a child to reach out to the warmth, now the warmth of the light caused her to pull away in fear. Since her eyes remained shut, she could not see where the light was, but she could feel the warmth of its presence, which caused her body to involuntarily shudder, afraid of once again being burned. The angel of mercy continued to sit with her, reassuring her of the true source of the light, proclaiming to her the freedom that could be found when you spend time in the light, attesting to the goodness, kindness, and love, not harm, that the light would bring. And although the wounded one continued to instinctively pull away whenever she was aware of the light, as long as the angel of mercy was near her, it eased her fears. Never growing impatient, the angel of mercy continued to sit with the wounded one, holding her hand and speaking soothing words of peace and truth. As time went on, the wounded one sat up and began to stretch out her legs. Her body grew stronger, And the day came when the angel of mercy and the wounded one were able to reach up together and remove the mud from her ears so that she could hear more clearly. And with this newfound freedom, the wounded one, who still clung to the hand of the angel of mercy, could now hear the helpers above. Their words of love and encouragement drifted down and fed her soul. These kind words were more wonderful than anything she'd ever known. She realized by their voices that some of them had even traveled partway down into this pit where she lived. Most had stayed at the upper levels where the darkness didn't consume them, but she could tell that someone else had now joined the angel of mercy by her side. Instead of just one to keep her company in this dark place, now she had two angels sitting beside her, holding her hands, bringing her comfort. One day, the angels of mercy, her helpers, took the wounded one's hands and helped her stand to her feet. They helped her walk around the small space that had been her prison for so long, gently encouraging her to explore her world. The wounded one clung to them in desperation, for she still refused to open her eyes, terrified of what she would see. They worked on strengthening her arms and legs with exercise, and they even introduced her to new foods they brought to nourish her and care for her body. Her helpers never grew frustrated with her, and when she reached out to them, she was always met with love rather than the harshness she so feared. And with her helpers by her side, it became part of her daily routine to spend time in the warmth of this good light that she was still so very afraid of. They sat and cried with her, and all the while bringing her comfort and support. And sometimes she still trembled inside, but she was not as frightened and numb as she once had been. And gradually she began to accept the warmth from the ray of light, trusting that it would not bring her pain. After 4 years of visiting with this wounded one, teaching her truths and helping her feel the presence of the light, the day came when it was time for her to open her eyes. It was the last step to prepare her for the journey out of this pit. She'd already become acquainted with her surroundings and her muscles had gained strength, but she would need her vision for the task ahead. Up until this point, the wounded one had gotten around by holding on to the hands of her helpers. But the only way she'd be able to get out of this pit was to climb out, which would require the use of both her hands and her feet. She would need to let go of the hands she held so tightly. This did not mean that her helpers would leave, but rather they would continue to stand on either side of her as she climbed out, supporting her, loving her, encouraging her, and all the while making sure that she didn't miss a step and fall back into the darkness. For her to make the ascent out of the pit, the wounded one would have to choose to open her eyes to see where she was going. This was more terrifying to her than anything up to this point. She remembered why she'd closed her eyes and made the vow to never open them again. However, there was a loving presence that seemed to urge and strengthen her to let go and face her terror. Alone, she could not have faced this terror, but with the love and support of her helpers, she had come to understand that she was no longer alone, that she was safe now. Without much warning, the day came when the wounded one's eyes opened. It was difficult at first to adjust, but eventually her vision cleared and she was looking out at her prison. Clinging to her helpers once again, she began to look around this place that had tormented her for so long. Every event that had transpired in this dungeon of darkness where she'd been held captive was branded into the very stone walls that surrounded them. Ever so timidly, the wounded one approached the wall, preparing to begin her ascent out of this place. But before she could let go of her helpers, she was confronted with the stark images of her past. The sights and scenes etched on the walls of her prison flood her vision, and the reality of her existence tears at her heart as for the first time she sees them through her adult eyes. Still clinging to her helpers, she allows the tears to spill over her cheeks and down her face. It is a new start, an acceptance, a moving forward. As she is embraced and encouraged by her helpers, she begins to let go and take her first steps towards freedom. She knows that with each picture she sees on her way out of the pit, a new wave of sadness may overcome her, but all she needs to do is to look at the left or the right, and her angels of mercy will still be there beside her. Thank you for listening to my story.